Picture a man who never once, in his entire life, drank a drop of whiskey. A committed teetotaler. He never touched alcohol, even though it sat on the shelves of his own shop day after day, year after year. You'd assume a man who refused to even taste his own product could never build an alcohol empire. Right? And yet John Walker created Johnnie Walker, the best-selling Scotch whisky on earth. It's sold in more than 180 countries. 223 million bottles fly off shelves every single year. He revolutionized an entire industry using a blending technique he borrowed from the tea trade. And he did it all while staying completely sober his whole life. Don't scroll past that. Let it sink in. The man who created the most recognizable whiskey on the planet couldn't have told you the difference between it and vinegar, simply because he'd never tasted either one. So how did a 14-year-old orphan who never drank become the father of the most famous whiskey in the world? To understand that, we need to go back to July 25th, 1805. Today I'll break down 6 turning points in this story, moments that could each have ended it before it began. Turning point 3 shows you how the tragedy that destroyed the family business paradoxically became the first step toward building an empire. Turning point 5 covers a catastrophic flood that wiped out an entire inventory overnight, and what an aging Walker did to refuse to quit. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is another lucky break story, right place, right time. Here's why that's wrong. Every decision John Walker made was built on one simple principle that the whiskey industry considered nearly sacrilegious, and that same principle, perfected across 3 generations of his family, built a brand worth $3 billion. John Walker was born on Todrig's farm near Kilmarnock, a small town in East Ayrshire, Scotland. The Scotland of his childhood was unforgiving. Farmers worked themselves to the bone for almost nothing. Families lived and died by weather and harvest. The Walker family was no exception. Alexander Walker, John's father, worked the land at Todrig's, while his wife Elizabeth ran the household and raised young John. But John was different from the other village boys. Even as a child, he had what locals would later call a spark in his eye, a restlessness. While other kids played in the fields, John watched his father haggle at market, absorbing every detail of trade and commerce. Farming wasn't his calling. His mind worked differently. He saw patterns where others saw chaos and opportunities where others saw obstacles. That spark was about to be tested by something no child should have to face. 1819. John was just 14 when his father died suddenly. Alexander Walker was gone, and with him went the family's only source of income. The farm couldn't survive without him. Young John watched everything his family had built get sold off piece by piece. The trustees gathered the proceeds from the sale, £417. That was it. That was the only thing standing between the Walker family and total ruin. Most 14-year-olds would have broken under that kind of pressure. John Walker was not most 14-year-olds. The trustees made a decision that changed the course of history. Instead of squandering the money or investing it too cautiously, they spent the £417 on a grocery, wine and spirits shop on King Street in Kilmarnock. And they put it in John's name, a teenage orphan with 0 business experience. Don't scroll past this either. Think about how insane that decision looked on paper. A group of adult guardians handed the entire remaining fortune of an orphaned family to a 15-year-old boy who had never spent a single day in trade. This wasn't a cautious strategy. It was an all-in bet on one teenager's character. The shop on King Street sat right at the heart of Kilmarnock, a town going through its own transformation. The textile industry was booming, coal mining was expanding, workers were pouring into town, and they needed goods. Competition was brutal. Kilmarnock already had established merchants who'd been in business for decades, with connections, reputations, loyal customers. And here was John Walker, an inexperienced teenager trying to compete with men twice his age. The first year was merciless. John had to learn everything on the fly: how to negotiate with suppliers, how to manage inventory, how to extend credit without getting burned, how to read customers and predict demand, how to stay ahead of trends. Every mistake cost money. The family couldn't afford to lose. Every wrong call could be the difference between survival and ruin. But John had advantages the older shopkeepers overlooked. Youth gave him energy, necessity gave him focus. And his late father had left him something even more valuable: 14 years of watching Alexander Walker haggle at markets. John had absorbed those patterns of trade like a sponge soaks up water. The shop sold everything a Scottish family might need: flour, sugar, coffee, exotic teas from China, pepper from Jamaica, spices from India, and of course, spirits: rum from the Caribbean, brandy from France, gin from England, and naturally, whiskey, lots of whiskey. And this is where things get interesting. John Walker, this teenage shopkeeper, was a committed teetotaler. He never touched alcohol, not a drop, not once in his life. The exact reasons aren't fully clear. Maybe religious conviction, maybe he'd simply seen too many men destroyed by drink. Whatever it was, his position was absolute. And yet, day after day, he was surrounded by casks and bottles of spirits other Scotsmen would practically kill for. And it was his job to sell them. Sit with the absurdity of that for a second. Imagine trying to sell wine without being able to tell a fine vintage from vinegar. Imagine selling perfume without being able to smell it. That's not just difficult, that should be impossible. Most people would see this as an unsolvable contradiction. How do you sell something you refuse to consume yourself? How do you understand quality without tasting it? How do you build trust with customers if you can't share a drink with them? In the drinking culture of 19th century Scotland, refusing alcohol was almost unheard of. It made you an outsider, an oddity. Some customers probably assumed John simply thought he was better than them. But John had a secret weapon: tea. The bridge here is simple but important. This exact secret, born out of a limitation rather than in spite of it, was about to become the foundation of an entire global industry. We left off on the strangest contradiction in this entire story. John Walker, a teetotaler selling spirits, surrounded by casks of whiskey he never so much as touched. But it was tea, not whiskey, that gave him the weapon that flipped an entire industry on its head. At the shop on King Street, John sold tea right alongside spirits. And tea, in the early 19th century, wasn't the simple, consistent product we know today. Every shipment arriving from China tasted different, depending on the harvest, the region, the conditions of a voyage halfway around the world. One batch might be bitter, another smoother. A third would carry a completely different aroma. Britain's experienced tea merchants had solved this problem through blending. They took leaves from different shipments and different regions and combined them to create one stable, recognizable, consistent flavor, regardless of what a specific harvest had done in a specific year. John Walker, selling tea day after day, studied this technique thoroughly. He understood the underlying principle: blending different sources creates stability where individual components are unstable. Now look at what was happening with whiskey in those same years, right next to the tea shelves. Scotch whiskey in the early 1820s was a wild, unpredictable product. Every small distillery, every farm, every cask was different. One cask might be smooth and sweet, the next harsh and burning. A third might carry so much smoke it was nearly undrinkable. There was no single standard, no consistent, recognizable flavor a customer could count on. Picture an ordinary coal miner in Kilmarnock, coming into the shop once a week after a brutal shift underground. He spends his hard-earned wages on a bottle of whiskey to warm himself up on a cold Scottish night. And sometimes he gets something smooth and pleasant. Sometimes he gets a genuinely awful batch he can barely choke down. He never knew in advance what he was going to get. It was a gamble every single time he put money on the counter. Stop for a second here. This is the emotional core that makes this whole story real. This isn't about abstract whiskey. This is about an ordinary, exhausted man who just wanted to get what he paid for and couldn't ever be sure of it. John Walker watched this problem play out in front of him every single day. And in his mind, one simple but revolutionary idea took shape. What if he applied the same principle to whiskey that was already being applied to tea? What if he took whiskey from different casks, different distilleries, and blended them together to create one stable flavor that customers could recognize and come to love, the same every single time? I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what's so revolutionary about mixing a few casks together? How hard can that be? Here's why it wasn't that simple. In the early 19th century, the Scotch whisky industry considered blending nearly sacrilegious. There was a widespread belief that real whiskey had to come from a single distillery, a single place, with one distinct character. Mixing different varieties was seen as cheating the customer, diluting authenticity, a cheap trick pulled by dishonest traders. But John Walker wasn't afraid to go against conventional wisdom. He had his own version of one core principle. If a rule stands in the way of solving a real customer problem, the rule needs to be broken. He started experimenting. Slowly, methodically, testing different proportions of different whiskies from different sources, searching for a combination that would deliver a stable, smooth, pleasant flavor no matter what batch of raw material came through the door. It was painstaking, invisible work by a small-town Scottish merchant nobody outside Kilmarnock had ever heard of. But it was exactly this work that would give birth to the principle an entire global whiskey industry would eventually be built on. Meanwhile, the shop on King Street kept growing steadily. John expanded his range. He started selling his own blended whiskey to local customers, first as a small line under his own quality control. People noticed the difference fast. Walker's whiskey was predictable. It was pleasant every time. Customers started coming specifically for it, instead of settling for whatever whiskey happened to be on the shelf. The bridge here matters. A small shop that started with £417 from a farm sale was turning into something far bigger than a grocery store. John Walker was building a reputation grounded in reliability, quality that became a trademark long before trademarks existed as a legal concept. By 1857, nearly 40 years after a frightened 15-year-old orphan first stood behind that counter, John Walker died. He was 53. He didn't leave behind a giant corporation or an international brand, just a solid, respected, profitable shop in a small Scottish town. By any measure of the time, that was a serious achievement for an orphan starting from nothing. But the real story was just beginning. The business passed to his son, Alexander Walker. And this is where the most important transformation in this whole story begins. Alexander was 20 when his father died. But unlike many heirs, he had no intention of just keeping an existing business afloat. Alexander had a rare combination of qualities: his father's commercial instinct paired with business ambition on a completely different scale. Don't scroll past this. Let it sink in. John Walker created a principle, but it was his son who would turn that principle into a brand the whole world would recognize. Alexander immediately zeroed in on his father's blended whiskey, recognizing something competitors had missed. This wasn't just a local product for Kilmarnock customers, it was a scalable business model. If a blend could be made consistent once, it could be repeated again and again and again at any volume, for any number of customers, anywhere in the world. Alexander stripped away nearly the entire retail grocery side of the business and focused almost exclusively on whiskey. He put blending on an industrial footing, buying large volumes of whiskey from distilleries across Scotland, mixing them according to tested proportions, and bottling the result under one recognizable name. It was Alexander Walker, not his father, who invented the famous square whiskey bottle in the 1870s. The reason was purely practical, with zero sentimentality. Square bottles didn't smash into each other during shipping the way round ones did. They also fit 20% more bottles into the same shipping crate. A simple piece of engineering, but it drastically cut shipping losses and boosted profit on every export batch. He also added the famous label, slanted at a 24-degree angle, a detail still used on Johnnie Walker bottles today. Legend has it the label was made larger and tilted specifically so it would stand out on a shelf crowded with competitors' bottles, a small 19th century marketing trick that still works today. By the 1880s, the company, now called John Walker and Sons, was exporting whiskey across the entire British Empire, to Australia, to India, to South Africa, to New Zealand. Alexander understood something many of his competitors didn't. The British Empire wasn't just a political structure. It was a ready-made trade network spanning the entire globe, and whiskey bottled in sturdy square bottles was perfectly suited for long ocean voyages. But the most important part is still ahead. Because turning a regional Scottish whiskey into the planet's most recognizable brand was only just beginning, and the next step would come from the third generation of the family, creating a symbol that would outlive them all. The third generation of the Walker family didn't just inherit a profitable company. They inherited a principle, two innovations in bottle and packaging, and an export network covering half the globe. But it was John Walker's grandsons, George and Alexander Walker Jr., who created the piece of the brand people recognize faster than most global corporate logos today. By the turn of the 20th century, the family business was selling dozens of different blends under different names and different labeling. Confusing, inconsistent, hard for customers to figure out what they were even buying. George Walker understood something simple. If you want to build a global brand, you need absolute clarity. One recognizable product, one clean lineup, one image people remember at a glance. In 1909, the company reorganized its entire range into three clear lines, distinguished by label color. Red label, an accessible everyday blend. Black label, a more aged, more premium product. And white label, a third variant, less enduring in the brand's history than the first two. Red and black label became the foundation of the entire future global empire. A simple system, brilliant in its clarity. Want an everyday whiskey? Grab the red bottle. Want something more refined for a special occasion? Grab the black one. No confusion. No complicated names to remember. Stop here for a second. This is the exact moment a small-town Scottish family business started thinking like a truly global company. Not more flavor, not more complexity, more clarity. Clarity is what scales across the world. Complexity doesn't. But the most brilliant marketing move wasn't the naming, it was the image. In 1908, the company hired caricature artist Tom Brown to create a new advertising image for the brand. George Walker asked him to depict the company's founder, John Walker, but not as he'd actually looked. The real John Walker, a small-town grocer, never wore a top hat or a monocle. He never rode around in a perfectly tailored frock coat and tall riding boots. Tom Brown drew an elegant gentleman in an early 19th century suit, top hat, monocle, walking stick, striding purposefully forward. This image became known as the striding man. It appeared on labels and advertising posters starting in 1909 and never left the brand for a single day since. Think for a second about how bold this move was. The company took the real story of a poor Scottish orphan and turned it into the image of an aristocratic, confident gentleman. Because that image sold whiskey around the world better than the truth about a bankrupt farm and a family's possessions sold off piece by piece. The myth turned out to be more powerful than the biography. And the Walker family understood that perfectly. The company paired the visual with a brilliant advertising slogan, "Born 1820, still going strong." The slogan hinted at two things simultaneously: the brand's long history and endurance, energy, unfading strength, exactly the qualities every man buying a bottle of whiskey wanted to see in himself. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, it's just a nice picture and a catchy slogan. How could that really build a global empire? Here's why it wasn't that simple. The striding man became the first genuinely recognizable mascot character in the history of global alcohol marketing. Long before the modern advertising industry existed, the Walker family instinctively understood something that would later become the foundation of all 20th century branding. People don't buy a product. They buy a story and an image they want to associate themselves with. By the early 1910s, the company was exporting whiskey to more than 120 countries around the world. Johnnie Walker, the name gradually simplified from the full John Walker and Sons to the more casual Johnnie Walker customers used, became synonymous with Scotch whiskey itself for millions of people who had never set foot in Scotland and would never lay eyes on Kilmarnock. But the road wasn't smooth. Decades of trials lay ahead, any one of which could have wiped out everything 3 generations of this family had built. World War I hit the entire British economy hard, including whiskey exports. Men went off to the front. Ocean trade routes became dangerous due to submarines and military blockades. Many small Scottish alcohol producers didn't survive that period at all. But the Walker Company, thanks to its established international network and reputation for consistent quality, held on. And then came a challenge that seemed literally fatal for the entire alcohol industry. Prohibition in the United States, introduced in 1920. Picture for a second the scale of this disaster for any alcohol company at the time. The United States was one of the largest whiskey markets in the world. And overnight, that market was officially closed for a full 13 years, from 1920 to 1933. For most producers, this meant bankruptcy, the total loss of their most profitable export market. Don't scroll past this. Let it sink in. A company built on the principle of predictability and reliability suddenly found itself in a world where its biggest market had vanished by the stroke of a single law. But the Walker family found a way to survive and even strengthen its position during this brutal period. Legal shipments of whiskey continued through territories neighboring the US, through Canada, through Caribbean islands where alcohol remained legal. Whiskey crossed the border through various channels, some of which walked a fine line under American law while remaining fully legal under the laws of the exporting countries. The Johnnie Walker brand stayed in American consumers' minds throughout the entire ban, and when Prohibition was repealed in 1933, customers came back to exactly the name they remembered from before the ban. This became one of the most important lessons in the brand's entire history. Reputation and recognition, built over decades, can survive even the complete shutdown of a market. The bridge here matters a lot. What looked like the end of an entire industry for competitors became, for Johnnie Walker, just one more stress test of a foundation a poor orphan from Kilmarnock had laid down nearly 100 years earlier. The 20th century brought new wars, new economic crises, new challenges from a changing global market. But again and again, the company returned to the exact same principle John Walker had discovered watching tea leaves get blended in his small shop. Stability through blending, reliability through scale, recognition through simplicity. By the mid-20th century, Johnnie Walker had become more than a successful whiskey brand. It had become a cultural symbol of Scotland itself for the rest of the world, a symbol recognized faster than the flag of the country it came from. But the most important part is still ahead. Because turning a regional product into a global cultural icon, one sold today in more than 180 countries, with 223 million bottles produced every year, required one more final act of transformation and a price the brand would have to pay for its own overwhelming success. By the end of the 20th century, Johnnie Walker was no longer just a family business. In 1925, the company became part of the major conglomerate Distillers Company Limited, and in 1997, after a series of mergers, it finally landed under the wing of the giant Diageo, the largest alcohol corporation on the planet, owner of dozens of global brands. For a brand that started with a single crate in a Kilmarnock grocery shop, this should have been the ultimate triumph. And in numbers, it was. By the 2000s, Johnnie Walker was selling in more than 180 countries worldwide. Over 180 million bottles moved every year, and by the 2010s, that figure passed 220 million. The brand was worth, by various estimates, more than $3 billion, more than the entire GDP of some small countries. But global dominance came at a price, and that price had to be paid exactly where it all began. In 2009, Diageo announced a decision that shook Scotland and sparked a genuine wave of outrage across the country. The company was closing the whiskey bottling plant in Kilmarnock, the very town where, nearly 200 years earlier, a 15-year-old orphan named John Walker had stood behind a grocery shop counter. More than 700 people lost their jobs overnight. Production was moved to larger, more automated plants elsewhere in Scotland, for the sake of savings, efficiency, and corporate global performance targets. Picture for a second a Scottish family in Kilmarnock, a father who'd worked at the Johnnie Walker plant for 23 years, a mother who'd started there right out of school at 17, and one morning, both of them learning that the plant that had put their hometown's name on the map worldwide was shutting its doors for good. Not because of bankruptcy, not because of bad sales, because corporate accounting decided it was more profitable that way. Don't scroll past this. Let it sink in. A town that had literally built its identity around the Johnnie Walker name for 2 centuries watched a global corporation, the inheritor of that legacy, rip the plant right out of its heart for a few extra points of margin. Unions protested. Local politicians appealed to Parliament. Thousands of people took to the streets of Kilmarnock in solidarity. But Diageo's decision didn't change. The plant closed in 2012. For the first time in nearly 200 years, Johnnie Walker bottling stopped completely in the town that was its true birthplace. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, so that's the end of the story. A giant corporation just gutted a small man's legacy for profit. Here's why it's not quite that simple. The very essence of what John Walker created almost 200 years earlier, blending, standardization, scalability, was exactly the principle that eventually made the Kilmarnock plant economically unnecessary. Walker built a system that worked independently of any specific place or specific cask. The irony is that this same system, pushed to the limits of efficiency by a global corporation, ended up sparing not even the brand's own hometown. Kilmarnock never fully recovered from that blow. Unemployment in the town rose. Part of the local economy, tied to the plant for decades, began to unravel. But the Johnnie Walker brand itself, freed from ties to any single location, kept growing worldwide faster than ever before. The bridge here matters a lot. This is exactly the moment the company made a decision that would test whether a 200-year-old brand could change along with the world, or risked becoming a monument to its own past. In 2018, after almost 110 years, during which the striding man had remained the brand's only face, the company introduced Jane Walker, the first female version of the iconic logo. The campaign was timed to the centennial of women's suffrage in the United Kingdom and the United States, and came with a promise to donate part of the profits to organizations fighting for women's rights. The reaction was mixed. Part of the audience welcomed the update to a century-old symbol as a timely, fair gesture. Some critics called the campaign a shallow marketing move that didn't solve any real problems inside the corporation itself. But the simple fact that the company took the risk of changing its most recognizable symbol for the first time in over 100 years showed something. Even the most conservative, most traditional brand in the world is capable of transformation when it decides survival requires it. Stop for a second on this. A company built on the principle of unwavering stability proved it was willing to change when the times demanded it. That's the exact same instinct that drove John Walker to break industry rules almost 200 years earlier, applying a tea technique to whiskey. Except now, that instinct was being applied not to the taste of the product, but to its cultural image. Today, Johnnie Walker remains the best-selling Scotch whiskey in the world. The brand has appeared in dozens of James Bond films, gets referenced in song lyrics across genres, from hip-hop to country, and has become part of pop culture far beyond anything John Walker could have imagined, standing behind the counter of his small shop in 1819. Every year, more than 223 million bottles move off shelves. That means roughly every second, somewhere in the world, someone opens a new bottle of Johnnie Walker. The brand is present in more than 180 countries, more countries than are recognized by the United Nations. But John Walker's legacy isn't just sales numbers, it's proof of one simple, powerful idea. A 14-year-old orphan who'd lost his father and his family's only source of income could easily have ended his life in the poverty of a Scottish farm, like thousands of other kids of his generation. Instead, he took a limitation, his own sobriety, his inability to rely on taste, and turned it into a method. He couldn't trust his own tongue. So he learned to trust a system, a principle, a repeatable process instead. He borrowed an idea from a completely different industry and applied it somewhere no one before him had thought to. Don't scroll past this. Here's the main lesson of this entire story. A limitation isn't always the enemy. Sometimes a limitation is exactly what forces you to find an unconventional path, one that turns out stronger than the obvious solution. John Walker never knew what his small shop would become. He died in 1857, a modest, respected merchant in a provincial Scottish town. He couldn't have foreseen his son's square bottles, his grandson's striding man, his great-grandson's global corporation. But the principle he discovered watching tea leaves get blended outlived him, outlived his son, survived 2 global crises, prohibition, 2 world wars, and the closure of the plant in his own hometown. It has survived nearly 200 years of history and is still at work today, in every single bottle being poured somewhere on the planet at this exact second. A man who never tasted his own product created a flavor recognized by billions of people around the world. That's how a poor Scottish boy created Johnnie Walker. Drop a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. Which moment in this story hit you hardest? His father's death and the trustees' decision in 1819, the idea of blending whiskey like tea, the creation of the Striding Man, or the closure of the Kilmarnock plant in 2012. Send this video to one specific person you know, someone who right now sees their own limitation or shortcoming as an insurmountable obstacle. This story might just show them that the exact same limitation could become their biggest advantage. Next week, we'll break down another success story, and it involves a decision that nearly destroyed an entire company overnight, because the founder refused to listen to literally everyone around him.